I'm giving a talk on behalf of Alena Vogt, who has been a master student in our project. She worked on this for a couple of years, or actually 1 year. She's now gone, and I have taken over the joy of presenting this work on her behalf. So it deals with conflicts. It's clearly relevant that conflicts, it's clear that conflicts matter in fisheries, because they can constrain cooperation, they can induce rule breaking, they can increase the cost of management, prevent compromise seeking. And a typical statement is that we primarily manage people, not fish, and therefore understanding conflicts matters. So we had at the start of our Rügen project, the first thing we wanted to do is go into the fishery, talk to stakeholders, and describe the presence and nature of conflicts in that fishery with very basic questions. Who are the conflict parties? What are the main conflict themes? What are the causes for the conflicts from a human perspective? And how do people respond to these conflicts? So this is qualitative social research, as opposed to what Dieter presented, which is quantitative. In fact, some of the stuff that we asked in his questionnaire was informed by this preparatory study, so to speak. So the qualitative research was a stakeholder analysis. Dieter, myself, but mainly Dieter and Alena later went into the field, and you see here a list of stakeholder groups that were analyzed with in-depth, semi-structured questionnaires. So there is a structure to the questions we asked, but then the results were typed by phone and then transcribed into written material and then coded afterwards using an inductively developed coding scheme. So it's a qualitative content analysis. So we transcribe later or assign codes of themes, of topics to the interview material, and then try to analyze the frequency of different themes that emerged from that interview material. It's not representative in the sense that it doesn't capture the exact proportions of the stakeholders, but it tries to look at a broader view of all these different stakeholders, and then to identify maybe in general, what are the topics of conflicts and how are they dealt with. To coding the interviews, we chose a framework that I published a few years back based on a social psychological conflict framework. So this framework basically tries to describe the main factors that underlie conflicts in fisheries. Conflicts in fisheries and in fact in human interactions more generally, are always goal interferences that lead to diminished satisfaction. And this then creates a conflict at the individual level. It could also be between individual groups of people, let's say fishers and anglers, which then might be answered through a coping mechanism. For example, violence or voting or going to a different place. And then there are a series of factors that should underlie the sensitivity to be in conflict. And these factors have to do with the broader embedding in which each of us live in the current environment. These can be cultural differences, institutional factors. These are the rule systems, formal and informal, like taboos and norms of proper behavior that are in place, and emotional factors. And this often leads to factors, to social identity patterns, such as people defining with a certain peer group, for example, fishers, or within the anglers, tourists and non-tourist anglers. So there might be some social identities forming that can then create communication barriers. And then depending on how much a certain group or individual depends on a resource, what the given expectations about the proper norms of behavior are, and what the general tolerance of the lifestyle of another group is, you can either go into conflict or avoid it. So basically, we try to look for markers in our interview material to classify the factors that are mentioned against this framework to explain conflicts. So I'll jump into the results right away. First of all, here's a breakdown in our interview material, which parties the different groups that are mentioned on the bottom perceived to be in conflict with. So there was some indication of diminished satisfaction or goal interference expressed in the interview material. And you see here the commercial fishers and the angling guides and tourist anglers, and almost everybody has two big groups which they perceive they have some form of conflict with. And this is either other anglers or other angler groups or commercial fishermen. over 50 to over 75% of all mentioned conflicts relate to those two groups. So it's really a dominant interaction between each individual sector and another party that is either fishing or that is angling. So that's the first statement on what are the main conflict parties that I were identified. So fishers, I just said that. Then in terms of the conflict themes, we looked at two ways here. First of all, we looked at how often these themes occur across the 46 interviews, and then how often these conflict themes emerged in terms of the individual codes assigned to each interview. So within an interview, multiple types of conflicts could have emerged. And again, a striking pattern emerges that there is two conflict themes that are dominant. And the first one is between fisheries users and conservation, non-fishing related conservation interests. And the second big dominant conflict is commercial fisheries with compared to angling in a broader sense. There are also other conflicts in the fishery, such as conflicts within anglers or between different angler groups, between fishery users and fisheries management and so on. Of course, there are many more, but there are two dominant ones. And for the sake of time, I will focus in explaining the details now on these first two conflicts that I mentioned here, which are the dominant conflicts: intersectoral fisheries and conservation, and intrasectoral fishers with anglers or anglers with other anglers. And the first one is the fisheries versus conservation conflict that we have in the Rügen fishery, that is simplified, for example, by this little picture here, which is, for example, we have a lot of nature conservation areas in the region, national parks, biosphere reserve, and so on. So many, many conflicts expressed in the questionnaire relates to this topic. So, and here are the main issues identified by our partners. Most of the issues between fisheries, angling on the one side and conservation on the others relate to bylaws and operational management issues. A dominant one is, for example, the conservation of fish predators. For example, cormorants is a big topic expressed by many people. And the second big share, around 25% of all the issues, were enforcement issues. And here people expressed concerns related to navigation bans that exist for motorboats, or the non-compliance with protected areas and issues like this. So where there are violations that may or may not be enforced, or they may occur only for certain players and not enforced for everybody. So these were the big themes in the conservation realm. And in order to explain this emergence of that perception of conflict, we can have a look here at at the clustering here of the different content related to the underlying framework that I mentioned to you in the beginning. So for example, a prominent reason why the conflict emerges is a cultural difference between fisheries interest and conservation perspectives. And for example, there's an intrinsic value attached to nature, and there's often a value conflict there between the overall, expectation of what should be preserved and what shouldn't. So for example, conservation interests say, this is all really important to us, maintaining of nature, leaving it on their own and not being fished, at least in part of the areas, is something we simply want. It's part of our DNA, so to speak. So that's a major first reason. It's different, social cultures in which conservation interests and fisheries interests develop. So it's more use-oriented versus more protection-oriented perspective. And then there's institutional factors. For example, the national park that is in the area might lose its status if it doesn't achieve 50% of the area to be not used at all by no form of fishing and no form of angling. And of course, if the entire existence of a certain protection area depends on that regulation, it's clear that there is a conflict, because obviously fishers and anglers want to maintain access also to areas in the national park. In addition, there have been rules institutionalized in the past, are sector specific. So particularly the commercial fishermen are getting exceptions in many areas because they maintain livelihood in terms of its use. And some anglers feel that this is a distributional injustice. So fishermen have other rights to access protected areas than most of the angling public has. And many anglers express this as an issue of distributional injustice. And then there's lots of complaints also about lack of enforcement of protection areas and so on, that people see others breaking the rule and being uncomfortably expressing concern that this might be an issue and should be enforced better. This then leads to emotional factors. For example, in a statement here by a fisher, we have fished here for decades and suddenly we are not allowed to enter this anymore, which is in response to the implementation of new protection areas. And then there's more subtle differences in the resource norms. So for example, many anglers and fishers perceive themselves as nature conservationists, and they have a perception that protection emerges from the use because there's an incentive to protect if you also enjoy the benefits of use. And by contrast, many conservation groups say that there should be a space of nature that is not used at all, right? So that's a different perception as how the nature in general should be used. And it's very visible, this conflict, in the protection of cormorants, as I mentioned already. And this finally leads to communication barriers. So there was a lot of complaints that nature protection results are not enforced in a dialogue. They are not, that fishers and anglers didn't feel embedded in the decision making and so on. That also contributes to the conflict. Second example I want to give you is about now an intra-sectoral conflict. That's commercial fisheries where there's recreational angles. That's the second big factor that we saw. So here we are dealing with more subtle differences. The conflict emerges around space, access to certain areas, around access to the resource itself, pike, and other issues. And a typical statement here by a tourist angler that we found very often, and we actually saw, I think, discussed on Wednesday, of course, we get annoyed when we see all these nets everywhere. So that's an example of a conflict around the resource, but it's also space conflict. Or a commercial fisherman who said, look, when they don't catch, so the anglers, it's always me. It's always my fault that I have overfished. So the accusation by many anglers that it's the fisher's fault that they don't catch anything. So that's a good example of perceptions that we have in this system. Now, if we look at the underlying reasons, these are manifold, so it's not monocausal again. The conflict between commercial and recreational fisheries seems to be affected first by institutional factors, some of which are already mentioned. There might be selective constraints to some groups that they are perceived unfair, for example, access to certain areas. But it's also caused by systematic data gaps that we have in the system. So we saw some of that discussion yesterday also already. Is this true that the anglers are catching so many pike? This can't be true. So there's always this blame game within the sector. And because the monitoring data are poor, there's not good possibility for a scientist to counter this argument. So these data gaps are really embedded in the institutional system and is a major cause of the angler-fisher conflict. Of course, also communication barriers are prevalent. There's very little current opportunities for anglers and fishers to interact. Within our project, we have designing a working group to actually improve that situation. And this is perhaps something that should be done in the future more. But at the time we did this survey, people expressed very limited possibilities to interact with the other group. And this, of course, reinforces patterns of social identity and aversion against the other group. Then we have also within the fisher-angler conflict lots of differences in the resource norms. So that each group has different expectations how the resource should be used. For example, fishers say, okay, this activity is my livelihood. So that is more important than a leisure activity, right? So that creates limited understanding perhaps of each other's own norms because you are miles apart in what you consider relevant. Or in terms of the catch and release and trophy fishing, fishers often, not all of them, but often dislike this practice because they say a fish is there to be eaten. It should be on the market. It's not something you play with and you catch and release just for fun. On the other hand, the anglers perceive some of the fishing gear to be unethical. Right? For example, using long lines with live bait fish, for which many fishers still have a permission for, so it's absolutely legal, while the anglers cannot use a live bait fish, and then there is a perception that the gear is perhaps something that should not be used. So it's unethical as a gear. Another argument is by many anglers, particularly the guides, that they consider themselves economically more important than a fish that is sold through the market price to commercial fishermen. So there's a revenue-based argument that is underlying this allocation problem. Finally, there is resource dependencies. We have heard by Dieter and others, anglers depend on large fish. That creates lots of utility. Large fish become scarce, fishing pressure is high. And here the blaming game is pretty pronounced, that many anglers think it's the fishermen's fault that these large pike are no longer present and so on. And this leads then to lack of tolerance of each other's lifestyle. Both groups devalue each other, as you see here in these quotes. I'm not going to read them out, but in the interview material, we have clear evidence that people devalue each other and use quite harsh wording. And this can then even in some cases lead to violence. For example, here a guide who even expressed that there was some damages, purpose damages done on commercial fishing gear in response. So this really can escalate, and this conflict has been shown escalation in the media, but also in individual behavior towards the other group. So this conflict is pervasive, it's there, it's just two examples of many that I could show, and the synthesis is that there are commonalities around this conflict. And these commonalities revolve around communication barriers, which relates to lack of information and maybe also data availability, to variation in the norms that people or groups of people have, and issues of procedural and distributional justice. So procedural justice means, do I feel involved in the procedure of fisheries management? And distributional justice, do I feel fairness in the distribution of the good that I desire? That is pike in our case. So all of this seems to be the key reasons. How can we improve that? Well, first recommendation we would give is that we need better data that people trust and establish opportunities to meet and co-design solutions. So stakeholder involvement in management processes, I think, could address some of this. The norms may not be harmonized. There might be some systemic differences that will persist, but if we allow rooms where fishers and anglers or conservationists and anglers come together and try to see where they have also similarities, it could improve at least the common understanding of other people's perceptions. And for the distributional and procedural justice, I think we need to involve people better in actual management decision-making. And if that's not enough, perhaps there might be some need for spatial temporal separation of the sectors, either directly or indirectly through a few new regulations, such as this harvest slot, that might produce a good that the anglers so much depend on without perhaps even affecting commercial fisheries to a large degree, who often harvest the intermediate-sized fishes. So with that, thank you for your attention, and hopefully we have a good discussion.